You stand in the jungle at night, where the air is heavy with heat and silence that feels alive. The leaves above shiver though there is no wind, and in the stillness you hear it, the low thrum of drums, far away at first, then closer until it rattles in your chest like a second heartbeat. Smoke rises in dark spirals, carrying with it the bitter sting of burning resin and the sour tang of sweat. The scent of copper lingers underneath, sharp and metallic, filling your lungs before you even understand what it means. Through the trees, the shadows break, and you see it, a pyramid carved from stone, its steps steep and jagged, as if built to pierce the sky itself. Fire crowns its peak, the flames bending in the night wind, casting long red arms across the clearing. Around its base, people gather, hundreds of them, faces lit in the shifting torchlight, bodies pressed together, their voices rising in a chant that is neither song nor prayer, but something more primal. The sound claws at you, demanding not to be ignored. The drums quicken, the torches sway. The chanting thickens into a single rhythm that makes the earth seem to move beneath your feet. And then you see them, figures emerging from the smoke, led up the pyramid steps by masked priests. Their hands are bound, their eyes wet with terror. Women, men, even children, each pulled forward, each trembling as the crowd roars approval. You realize, with a cold dread, that this is not a spectacle meant for death alone. The signs are there, written in the gestures, in the objects carried by the priests, in the way the bound captives are touched and displayed. Here, sexuality is no private act. It is public, ritualized, twisted into something sacred and brutal at once. Pleasure is not sought. Choice does not exist. What unfolds before you is not intimacy, but worship, not devotion, but terror, performed in the name of gods whose hunger can never be sated. This is the Maya few dare to remember, not the mathematicians who mapped the stars, not the architects who raised stone cities from the jungle floor. This is their hidden face, their most terrifying inheritance, practices that mingled sex with blood, desire with death, until the two were no longer separable. What you are about to hear will not be found in textbooks. It survives only in fragments, in whispers, in the shadows of history itself. If you can sit here and listen to the darkest side of history, but still don't subscribe to Tale of History, ask yourself, are you really curious about the truth, or do you just scroll past it? They called their land the heart of the world, a place where stone rose from jungle and time itself was measured by gods. Stretching across what is now Mexico, Guatemala, Belize and Honduras, the Maya carved entire cities out of green wilderness, palaces, pyramids, ball courts, temples that seemed to touch the sky. But these were not just monuments of stone, they were vessels of belief, symbols of a universe ordered by cycles that bound every life from birth to death and beyond. The Maya did not see time as we do. To them, existence was a wheel turning endlessly, seasons returning, crops sprouting and withering, blood flowing, then flowing again. Every beginning demanded an ending. Every creation demanded a destruction. The sun rose not because it must, but because it was fed. Rain fell only when the gods were pleased, and what pleased the gods was sacrifice. Religion was not separate from life, it was life. Every breath, every offering, every act of the body belonged to the gods. The maize that fed them, the blood in their veins, the cries of newborn children, all of it was woven into an endless exchange between mortals and divine. But this exchange came with fear, for the gods were not gentle. They demanded intensity. They demanded suffering. They demanded that the boundaries of the human body be crossed in ways that terrified even the faithful. Sexuality, in this world, was not hidden in shadow. It was a sacred force, as powerful as the rain and the sun. To give life was to touch the divine, and so the act of sex itself could not remain private. It belonged to the gods before it belonged to humans. Desire, union, even violation. These were tools the Maya used to speak to the forces they worshipped. To understand why, you must imagine how fragile their survival was. One season without rain could starve a city. One failed harvest could kill thousands. To them, fertility was not just about children. It was about corn growing tall, rivers filling, forests bearing fruit. And so rituals of fertility were not acts of celebration. They were acts of desperation. They bound themselves to the belief that sex, blood, and sacrifice together could keep the cycle turning. It is here, at the crossroads of devotion and terror, that the most terrifying practices took root. To the Maya, sex could sanctify a temple. It could seal a pact with the gods. It could bless the rains, but it could also mark a victim, strip them of purity, and prepare them for death. Every gesture carried meaning, and that meaning was always heavier than the flesh it touched. If you are still listening, if you feel the weight of what is being revealed, and yet have not subscribed to Tale of History, consider this. You are a witness to secrets torn from the shadows of the past. If you take them and walk away in silence, ask yourself, what kind of witness are you? Support the telling of these stories. If not, step into the comments and tell me why you refuse. Fertility was the heartbeat of Maya life. Every stalk of maize, every drop of rain, every child born into the world was a reminder that survival depended on forces far beyond human control. To keep these forces balanced, the Maya turned to ritual. They believed fertility was not only physical, but cosmic, a sacred current that flowed through the bodies of men and women, through the soil, through the heavens themselves. And to keep that current alive, it had to be renewed through acts that blurred the line between devotion and terror. Festivals were the stage where fertility was displayed, not hidden. At planting season, as fields lay open waiting for maize, the people gathered in the plazas beneath their towering temples. Drums thundered, flutes wailed, and incense smoke swirled in the air until the boundary between mortal and divine seemed to vanish. At the center of these gatherings, couples were brought forward, chosen not for love but for ritual duty. Their union was not private. It was performance. Before the gaze of the community, and under the watchful eyes of priests, their bodies became instruments of prayer. Every movement, every gasp, every act was believed to echo upward, summoning the gods who controlled the rains. There was no shame in this exposure, but there was fear. To falter, to resist, was to risk offending deities whose wrath could withhold the skies. The crowd did not watch for spectacle, but for survival. Each act was a message, a desperate plea. Let the maize grow. Let the rivers flow. Let the people live another season. Yet the rituals did not end in union alone. For the Maya, pleasure was never enough to feed the gods. The ceremonies demanded something sharper, something drawn from the body itself. And so, when the act was done, there came the offering. Priests would approach with obsidian blades, and in a gesture both sacred and excruciating, men pierced their genitals, women bled from sacred wounds, their pain rising like incense into the night. The mingling of sex and blood was not seen as grotesque, but as holy, the ultimate sacrifice of life force to sustain the earth. Imagine the silence of the crowd broken only by the cries of those chosen. The ground beneath their feet, soaking in drops, meant not for soil, but for gods. This was fertility to the Maya. Not celebration, but endurance. Not joy, but terror, wrapped in reverence. I know this is disturbing to hear, but if you're still watching and not subscribing, it means you're taking without giving. Think about that. Support Tale of History, or at least, tell me in the comments why you won't. In the heart of Maya cities, beneath the towering pyramids, and within the courtyards of temples, there existed a practice that revealed just how far devotion could be twisted into control. It was called sacred service, though its true form was nothing less than sexual servitude. The Maya did not speak of sin as later civilizations would. Desire was not condemned, it was consecrated. The body, they believed, was a vessel of divine energy, and to offer it in service to the gods was the highest form of sacrifice short of death itself. Thus, within temple walls, men and women were given over not to prayer or meditation, but to acts that were said to sustain the gods' hunger. To serve sexually was not considered disgraceful, it was called holy. Yet for those forced into it, the holiness masked a deeper horror. Not all who entered these temples came willingly. Slaves captured in war were stripped of choice and remade as offerings. War captives who were spared the blade often found themselves bound to a slower fate, their bodies traded as gifts to the gods. Sometimes, children were included, their youth believed to carry a purity that amplified the ritual's power. Families whose bloodline had been conquered could only watch as their sons and daughters were absorbed into the machinery of devotion, their cries muffled by chants and smoke. Even among the Maya themselves, the system reached far. Nobles, eager to prove loyalty or to strengthen ties with the priesthood, would dedicate servants, concubines, or even kin to temple service. It was presented as generosity, as piety, as the noble family placing itself closer to the gods. But beneath the veil of duty was calculation. To give a body was to buy favor, to ensure blessings, to wield power, not just in this world, but in the one beyond. Inside the temples, the servants became property not of men, but of the divine, or so they were told. Their identities were erased, their choices silenced. They were expected to perform as commanded, their acts overseen by priests who declared each movement sacred, each submission necessary. To refuse was to defy the gods themselves, a crime more unthinkable than death. To the worshippers outside, these rituals were hidden, spoken of in reverent tones, but seldom described in detail. To question them was to question the foundation of faith, and so the practice endured, cloaked in the language of holiness, while its victims bore the weight of silence. The Maya had created a system where sexuality was not freedom but bondage, where faith demanded flesh, and where servitude was sanctified by ritual. It is this merging of power and belief that makes their practices so haunting, so terrifying, not because they were seen as evil, but because they were called sacred. If you are still here, if you have allowed yourself to step into the shadows of this past, and you hear these voices long silenced, then do not stand silent yourself. Subscribe to Tale of History, and acknowledge the cost of bringing these stories back into the light. If you refuse, then tell me in the comments why you choose silence, why you take without giving. Virgins in Maya civilization were not simply young women, they were vessels of untouched power. To the Maya, purity was not innocence, it was fuel. Their belief was chilling. The untouched body carried a raw, untapped energy, and when offered to the gods, that energy was thought to ignite the spiritual world and secure divine favor. But the way that purity was harvested is where the true terror lies. In ritual after ritual, young girls were chosen, often from childhood, groomed by their families, or seized as captives. Some believed it was an honor, others had no choice. These virgins were kept apart, watched carefully to ensure no man touched them, because the gods, they said, demanded their first and final gift at once. And then came the most haunting rite of all, ritual deflowering. The act itself was not an intimate union, but a ceremonial violation. Before a virgin was laid upon the altar, her body was ritually taken, her purity consumed not for her own life, but for the survival of the community. Imagine the terror in their eyes, to be stripped not just of life, but of the one thing their culture had marked as divine. It was the blending of two ultimate taboos, sex and death, in a single act. For the Maya, this was no cruelty, it was mathematics of the cosmos. Virgin blood was powerful, but virgin sexual energy was unmatched. To them, The gods craved it as a spark to keep the rains falling, the crops growing, the stars moving. It was sacrifice, but with an added torment that ensured the offering was as potent as possible. Picture the scene: a great plaza, hundreds watching, priests chanting, drums beating in rhythm with the girl's trembling heart. She knows what awaits her. She knows the moment her body is touched, her life is already over. The crowd does not see a victim. They see a living gift, a flame about to be extinguished to warm the gods. When the blade finally fell, the sacrifice was not just flesh and blood, it was innocence itself, and here lies the true horror. These virgins walked knowingly into a fate that combined the deepest fears of humanity: violation and execution, back to back, inseparable. A death that was not just an ending, but a ritualized breaking of the self. Now pause with me. If this feels heavy to you, remember, it's heavier for me to research and bring it to you. These are not easy stories to uncover, nor to tell, but they are necessary to remember. Subscribe to Tale of History if you value this work, and if you refuse, then at least tell me why in the comments. Because silence says you're fine taking and giving nothing back. They believed the universe itself was held together by opposites, life and death, sun and moon, man and woman. But in certain ceremonies, those boundaries were not just blurred, they were deliberately torn apart. Shamans would lead men into trances where ordinary rules no longer applied. In those moments, sexual acts between men were not seen as forbidden, but as tools to unlock divine vision. For the Maya, the body was a vessel, and its boundaries could be broken if it meant pleasing the gods. During great festivals, roles were reversed: men dressed as women, women as men. Shamans declared that such reversals mirrored the cosmos, that creation itself was born from the collision of opposites. To deny this ritual was to risk chaos. So, when a priest commanded, there was no refusal. Participants became symbols, their bodies repurposed to act out the eternal struggle of balance. It wasn't about love or choice, or even desire. It was about submission. Every act, no matter how humiliating or painful, was a performance for the gods. Some rituals demanded sexual violence, inflicted publicly, with the entire community watching, as if the shame itself was part of the sacrifice. For the victims, there was no escape. Their bodies became altars, their will erased beneath the weight of divine expectation. What makes these practices so haunting is not that they existed, but that they were seen as necessary. Imagine living in a world where to refuse such a command was not rebellion, it was treason against the universe. A single refusal could condemn not just yourself, but your family, your village, your harvest. The pressure to submit was absolute, and in that pressure lay the true horror. The Maya saw transgression not as corruption, but as transformation. To step outside normal boundaries was to step closer to the divine. And so every violation, every forced reversal, every coerced act was justified as sacred. For those who endured it, the scars were not only physical, they lived with the knowledge that their humiliation had been demanded, sanctified, and applauded. And now, let me turn this back to you. You are hearing this history not as entertainment, but as a revelation of what people once endured in the name of belief. If you have stayed with me this far, I ask you to reflect: are you simply consuming this story in silence, or will you support the work it takes to uncover it? Subscribe to Tale of History if you value the courage it takes to speak these truths aloud. If you won't, then I invite you to at least explain why in the comments. Because silence too is a choice. In the deepest temples, where incense smoke hung thick like a fog of spirits, blood became the language of devotion. Not any blood, but the blood of the body's most intimate parts, drawn deliberately, ritually, to feed the gods who hungered beyond human comprehension. Genitals were pierced, sliced, or pricked, and every drop that fell was believed to carry the essence of life itself upward into the heavens. Pain was not accidental, it was required. The suffering of the flesh was seen as a conduit, a bridge between mortal and divine. Priests and nobles alike submitted themselves to these acts, sometimes in private, sometimes in the glare of a crowd that had gathered to witness the sacred horror. Blades of obsidian gleamed in torchlight as they pierced, cut, and tore. Yet each wound was a prayer, each scar a statement of faith. Some rituals went further, combining sexual penetration with the cutting of flesh, entwining ecstasy and agony until they could no longer be separated. The boundary between sacred devotion and torture vanished, leaving only the act itself necessary, terrifying, absolute. The crowd watched in silence, or in chanting, never questioning the sanctity of what they saw. To them, these acts ensured rains would fall, crops would grow, and the sun would rise. But for those who endured the piercing, the bleeding, the ritualized violation, it was a terror that seared into memory. Flesh and spirit alike were offered, consumed by belief, transformed into something beyond ordinary comprehension. And here you are, hearing it centuries later. You are a witness to horrors that are no longer possible yet once dictated the survival of a civilization. You're still here, listening to some of the most terrifying truths in human history. If you won't subscribe after this, why? Why take the story and walk away? Tell me in the comments. I want to hear your excuse. In the cities of the Maya, where stone temples rose like mountains from the earth, sexuality was never merely personal. It was a language of authority, a weapon of influence, a measure of control. Kings and priests understood that the body could be bent to will, that desire could be harnessed, that intimacy could be orchestrated as carefully as a battle plan. Every act of sex could become a demonstration of power, a statement to the people that the elites controlled, not only life and death, but the very impulses of those beneath them. Within palace walls and temple chambers, sexual rituals were choreographed. They were not private moments of passion, but public performances, designed to show the populace that obedience was total, that the hierarchy was unbroken, that no one escaped the reach of those who claimed divine authority. Women, men, and even children could be made part of these ceremonies, their bodies instruments of political theater, their suffering transformed into proof of the elite's supremacy. In these rituals, the line between worship and coercion disappeared. Pleasure was irrelevant. Consent was irrelevant. What mattered was the message. Every trembling body, every bound hand, every suppressed cry reinforced the order of the world as the Maya understood it. The gods demanded obedience, and through them the kings and priests exacted it. Sexual acts became a mirror of cosmic and social hierarchy alike, reminding everyone that to live was to serve, to perform, to submit. Power was not wielded in whispers or threats alone. It was displayed in flesh, in ritual, in acts that left no one untouched by the demonstration. Those who participated understood that their bodies were no longer their own, and those who watched understood that defiance would not be tolerated. Sex was not private. It was surveillance, intimidation, and control all in one. It was a force of nature as vital and terrifying as the storms that could drown a city or the droughts that could starve it. If you have remained with me through the depths of what humans were made to endure and observe in the name of gods and kings, consider your responsibility now. Subscribe to Tale of History. If you do not, reflect on why you are taking these truths, letting them settle in your mind, and walking away without acknowledgement. Go to the comments and tell me why you refuse to support the work that brings these shadows into the light. The cities of the Maya have long since fallen silent. Stone pyramids rise above the jungle, their surfaces worn by centuries of wind and rain, yet the shadows they cast are long and dark, stretching across time itself. The people who once gathered, who danced, who chanted, who bled and loved in the name of gods, none remain. Yet their rituals linger, whispered through the cracks of history, preserved in glyphs, murals, and the fragmentary accounts of those who survived. These were not stories of simple devotion or piety. They were stories where sex became a weapon, a tool of survival, a mechanism of control, and a bridge to the divine. They were rituals that forced humans to confront the deepest terror and the highest faith at once, where the boundaries between pleasure, pain, and power were obliterated. To look upon the ruins is to see only stone, but to imagine the ceremonies is to feel the echo of cries, of bodies and spirits laid bare, of lives offered willingly or not to sustain the cycles that governed their world. And so we are left with haunting questions. Did the Maya act in enlightened reverence, seeking to balance life and cosmos with devotion beyond comprehension? Or were they, each one, enslaved by the very gods they worshipped, trapped in a system where their bodies, desires, and fears became instruments of something larger and more terrifying than themselves? You have just sat through 20 minutes of the darkest history you will ever hear. If you still haven't subscribed to Tale of History, ask yourself, why? Is it fear, denial, or simple neglect? And if you truly cannot subscribe, then go to the comments and explain why. But if you believe that stories like this, stories that survive only through the courage of those who research and recount them, deserve to be told, then subscribe now. Don't be silent.